I still remember clearly the last time I stood in front of that house, the one bearing the Coleman name, yet never truly considering me a part of it. That day I stepped onto the old wooden porch, hearing laughter echo from inside, a familiar sound belonging to people who had always believed they stood above me. When the door opened, the first look they gave me was not curiosity or welcome, but a cold evaluation, as if I had brought along an inconvenience no one wanted. The house sat on the outskirts of Austin, Texas, where time seemed to slow along with the darkened wooden walls aged by years. This was the family house, the place where everyone gathered whenever money, wills, or land were involved. I had been invited back this time for a family meeting to discuss the inherited piece of land they believed would soon turn into cash. No one said it outright, but I understood perfectly. I was there to make up the numbers, not to speak. Seated around the long table in the living room were familiar faces. Richard Coleman, the uncle who always saw himself as the pillar of the family, occupied the central seat. Linda, his wife, sat beside him, arms crossed, scanning me from head to toe. The others nodded in brief acknowledgement. Some did not even bother to look. In their eyes, I was still the Hunter Davis from 10 years ago, the poor nephew who left the family and never amounted to anything. The conversation began without me. They talked about the land, the selling price, the division of money. I listened in silence, feeling every word like small cuts. No one asked for my opinion, and when I was about to speak, Richard glanced at me with a half smile. He asked what I did for a living, his tone hovering between curiosity and mockery. I answered briefly, without details. That response only seemed to confirm their belief that I had nothing of significance. The jokes started to surface, at first light, then increasingly blunt. They commented on the car I drove, the clothes I wore, the fact that I did not have a stable home like they did. I sat there, back straight, hands resting on my knees, letting every remark pass. In that moment, I understood that to them, a person's value was measured by appearances, and I did not meet that standard. Then Richard asked the question that made the whole room laugh. He asked whether, if the land were divided, I could afford the taxes and associated costs. The question was tossed out lightly, like a joke, but his eyes revealed it was a declaration of status. I looked around the table, saw the approving smiles, the silent agreement. That was when I realized there was no place for me in this meeting, and there never had been. I did not argue. I did not explain. I simply nodded slightly, as if accepting the role they assigned me. Inside, I memorized every detail, how they spoke about money, how they looked at me, how certain they were that I stood beneath them. I knew I had not come here to change anyone's mind. When the meeting ended, I stood up, politely thanked them, and said I understood the family's decision. No one stopped me. I stepped outside and stood on the porch for a moment, taking in the hot, dry Texas air. This time, I did not leave feeling defeated. I left with a cold certainty. I had not returned to ask for a share, and today's meeting was only the beginning. After that meeting, I did not drive straight back to where I was staying. I took the car north of Austin, moving slowly along the roads that bordered the inherited land scattered behind old steel fences. To them, it was nothing more than an abandoned property, a yearly tax burden. To me, it was a map that had been drawn long ago, waiting for someone patient enough to read it. That land lay close to the city's new development corridor, where residential projects and commercial zones were quietly expanding. I had been tracking this area for years, not through rumors or brokers, but through data, zoning plans, and closed-door meetings my family had never known about. In my mind, the value of that land was not the number they argued over in the living room, but the number that would appear a few years later. Meanwhile, on the other side, the Coleman family saw only immediate cash. Calls between them started pouring in the very next day. They talked about selling quickly to avoid risk, about tax pressure, about not wanting to sit on dead land. I heard it all through fragmented conversations, complaints passed to me almost unintentionally, as if they had forgotten that I was listening too. They hired a lawyer to handle the paperwork, a man named Mark Reynolds, known for working fast and asking few questions. When I heard his name, I understood that my family was ready to sign anything as long as the money came in quickly. None of them mentioned reassessing the land's value, and none considered holding on to it for a few more years. To them, time was the enemy. I was invited back once more, this time not for a formal meeting, but to get an update. I came and took my old seat, the same corner of the table. They talked among themselves about the expected selling price, about how to divide the money fairly. I heard excitement in their voices, mixed with a slight worry that the buyer might push the price down. When I asked a single question, whether they had reviewed the city's new zoning plan, the room fell quiet for a few seconds. Richard looked at me, irritation flickering in his eyes, then said those things were too complicated and unnecessary. He said selling early was the smartest choice, especially for people like me who did not understand the market. That remark did not make me angry. It simply confirmed what I already knew. They did not lack information, they lacked patience. They were not poor, they were afraid of waiting. And in that fear, they were willing to hand decision-making power to anyone who promised fast money. The conversation ended without an official conclusion, but I knew they had already decided in their minds. The contract signing date was mentioned, like a fixed point in time. I left that house once again, this time with a clearer sense of my role. I was no longer an outsider, even if they still believed I was. On the drive back, I made a short phone call confirming what I had prepared long ago. I had no intention of stopping my family from selling the land. I also had no plan to save them from a bad decision. I only needed to make sure that when everything unfolded, I would be sitting on the right side of the negotiating table. There was a long period in my life when the Coleman family had no idea how I was living. To them, I disappeared. To me, it was the only time I truly lived as myself. I left Austin with almost nothing but an old car and a few faint connections. No one saw me off, and no one asked how I would survive. Perhaps they assumed I would eventually come back, as before, empty-handed. The early years passed in silence and impact. I took on all kinds of jobs just to survive, from physical labor to positions no one wanted to keep for long. I learned how to observe people, how to read situations, and more importantly, how to stay silent. No one in my family knew that during those years, I began entering the world of investing, not with money, but with time and patience. I met people who did not care where I came from. They only cared about what I understood and what I could see before others did. I sat in small rooms, listening to conversations that, if retold, my family would dismiss as unrealistic. I learned how to read zoning plans, how to analyze market cycles, and how to wait while others lost patience. Meanwhile, the image of me in my family's eyes remained frozen at a fixed point in time. They thought I was unstable, without a clear career, and forever lagging behind them. I did not correct that perception. I let them keep the old impression because it gave me more freedom than any explanation ever could. When news about the inherited land began circulating in investment circles, I was among the first to recognize its true value. Not because it belonged to my family, but because it sat exactly where I had been watching for years. I knew someone would eventually approach the Coleman family, and I also knew they would not be patient enough to wait. When they announced they had chosen a buyer, I was not surprised. The signing date was set quickly, as if they feared that even a moment's hesitation would make the opportunity vanish. I sat alone in my small apartment, looked at the calendar, and realized the time had come. Not to interfere, but to step into the light at the right moment. I began putting everything back in order. Calls were made, confirmations were sent. I did not need to appear early. I only needed to ensure that when my name was mentioned, everyone in the room would be forced to stop and listen. Not because I spoke loudly, but because I stood in a position they could not ignore. Throughout the preparation, I never thought about revenge. I thought only about balance. The years of being underestimated had taught me one thing. Power does not come from proving yourself right, but from controlling the moment you enter the game. And this time, I knew I would arrive neither early nor late. The night before the contract signing, I slept deeply. No anxiety, no anticipation. I had waited too long for this moment to doubt it. When I woke up, I knew one thing clearly. The next day, my role in the eyes of the Coleman family would change forever, whether they were ready for it or not. The contract signing day arrived faster than I expected. That morning, Austin was as busy as ever. But to me, the city seemed to slow down. I was not in a hurry. I knew exactly when I needed to appear, and I also knew I did not need to arrive early to witness their excitement. I let the morning pass calmly, preparing everything in the most minimal way, as if this were just an ordinary appointment. The law office was located in the city center, a glass building that felt cold and orderly. When I entered the lobby, the Coleman family was already almost fully present. I stayed at a distance, observing. Richard was speaking with the lawyer, his voice full of confidence. Linda sat beside him, her eyes constantly scanning the room, both eager and wary. The others spoke in low voices, calculating the money they believed would be in their hands within a few hours. I did not move closer. I chose a seat at the back where no one paid attention to my presence. In their eyes, I was still irrelevant, someone there merely to fulfill a formality. I listened as they talked about the terms, the disbursement timeline, and how the buyer had agreed to the final price. No one suspected anything. Everything seemed neatly arranged. Time passed, but the buyer's representative had not yet arrived. At first, it was only a few minutes of waiting. Then the atmosphere in the room began to shift. Richard checked his watch and frowned. The lawyer, Mark Reynolds, made a call to confirm, his voice maintaining professional calm. Linda appeared irritated, whispering that the buyer should not keep them waiting like this. The following minutes stretched uncomfortably long. The initial confidence gradually turned into restlessness. I sat still, observing every small reaction. I saw Richard begin to lose patience, saw some relatives whisper anxiously that the deal might run into trouble. No one said it aloud, but the fear of losing money had begun to creep in. Richard suddenly turned toward me. He asked if I knew what was going on, his tone edged with irritation. The question made the entire room look in my direction. I shook my head slightly and replied that I was waiting like everyone else. That answer did not seem to satisfy him, but he did not press further. Then the meeting room door opened. A woman stepped in, dressed neatly, her eyes sharp. I recognized her immediately. Sarah Whitman, the representative of the land buying company. She apologized for the delay and briefly explained that there was a detail that needed to be reconfirmed before signing. The room immediately softened. Smiles returned, though with a hint of caution. Sarah sat down and placed her folder on the table. She flipped through a few pages and exchanged brief words with the lawyer. I saw Richard gradually regain his confidence, as if everything had returned to its familiar course. No one noticed that Sarah occasionally glanced in my direction, as if waiting for a signal. When Sarah stopped at the final page, she looked up and asked whether all parties directly involved in this decision were present. Richard answered immediately that the family was complete. Sarah nodded, then added that there was one more person who needed to confirm. She turned and looked straight at me. The room fell silent. I stood up and took a few steps toward the table. No one understood what was happening. I could feel the confused, uncomfortable, even suspicious stares. But I did not explain. I simply looked at Sarah and gave a slight nod. That was the moment I knew everything was moving exactly as planned. I had not spoken a single word yet, but my presence in this position was enough to shatter every assumption the Coleman family had built over the years. And as I prepared to speak, I knew this room would never look at me the same way again. I stood beside the conference table, clearly sensing the shift in the air. The people who had once treated me as excess now looked at me with expressions of confusion and caution. No one spoke, but that silence weighed heavier than any question. I knew that the moment I opened my mouth, everything in this room would begin to slip out of their familiar orbit. Sarah looked at me, waiting. The lawyer, Mark Reynolds, also paused, his pen hovering above the page. Richard was the first to break the silence. He asked, in a voice trying to remain calm, why my name had been mentioned in this signing meeting. The question was not curiosity, but a belated resistance. I answered slowly without raising my voice or avoiding the issue. I said that I was directly involved in this transaction, and that my involvement had existed long before his family began searching for a buyer. I did not provide details immediately. I let the statement hang, enough to force them to reconsider all their assumptions. Richard let out a dry laugh, suggesting that I was exaggerating my role. A few relatives nodded in agreement, as if they needed that denial to preserve their sense of security. I did not react. I simply looked at Sarah. She gave a slight nod, then turned to the lawyer. Sarah stated clearly that the primary funding for this transaction came from an investor operating behind the scenes, who had authorized her company to negotiate and acquire the land. As she said this, her gaze shifted toward me. This time, no one laughed. The room grew tense. Linda leaned slightly toward Richard and whispered something. Others began flipping through the documents in front of them, as if an explanation might be found somewhere on the pages. I realized that moment was the boundary. From here on, they no longer controlled the narrative. I added, still in a composed tone, that I had not come to stop the signing. I also had no intention of complicating matters. I was there only to confirm that the final terms accurately reflected the agreement between the buyer and the investor. I did not mention money. I did not mention power. I spoke only of responsibility. Richard began to lose patience. He asked me directly what role I was actually playing. I looked straight at him, for the first time not avoiding his gaze. I said that I was the one who had approved the funding, and that I was the one with the authority to decide the final terms. The air in the room seemed to freeze. No one argued immediately, not because they believed me, but because they had not yet grasped what was happening. I could see confusion spreading, slow but certain. Those who had been joking moments earlier now sat silently, avoiding each other's eyes. Sarah continued, confirming what I had just said in cold legal language. Each sentence she spoke felt like a stamp pressed down, turning my words into an irreversible reality. When she finished, there was no longer any doubt in the room. I felt no satisfaction. I did not feel the need to prove anything further. I simply realized that my role had finally been placed where it belonged. And from that moment on, every negotiation would have to pass through me. I looked around the room one last time and said that we could proceed once everyone was ready to accept that reality. After the truth was laid on the table, the room was no longer a place for assumptions. I could clearly sense the change in everyone's eyes. The open contempt was gone, but acceptance had not yet arrived. They were suspended between two states, wanting to believe everything could still return to the way it was, and fearing that what I said was true. Lawyer Mark Reynolds was the first to regain his working rhythm. He cleared his throat and suggested continuing the signing process as scheduled. Sarah nodded, but before he could turn to the next page of the contract, she looked at me and asked whether I had any additional requirements. The question was not loud, but it was enough to draw everyone's attention back to me. I said that I did. I did not state the condition immediately. I only asked for a brief pause to clarify a few points in the final agreement. Richard shifted in his seat, clearly displeased. He said everything had already been agreed upon, and that last-minute changes were unnecessary. I listened without interrupting, letting him finish. When Richard stopped, I spoke. I said that what had been agreed upon earlier was between the seller and the buyer, but now we were discussing the investor's confirmation. And my responsibility was to ensure that this transaction reflected the criteria I had set from the beginning. I did not look at anyone in particular, but I knew each person felt that the statement was directed at them. I then began to state the final condition. It was not about the selling price, nor about the payment timeline. My condition concerned how benefits would be allocated within the family. I said that the distribution would no longer be calculated based on old assumptions, but would instead depend on each person's level of participation and attitude during the decision-making process. The room immediately stirred. Linda reacted first. She asked what that meant. I answered clearly that those who had directly participated, signed, and taken responsibility would retain their portions. The others, those who stood on the sidelines or deliberately belittled someone else, would have to accept a smaller share, not as a punishment, but as a consequence. Richard stood up abruptly. He said this was a family matter and that no one had the right to interfere. I looked at him calmly and said that I was not interfering in his family. I was simply defining the conditions under which my capital would be used. If those conditions were not accepted, the transaction would stop right there. The tension became almost suffocating. I saw some people lower their heads, avoiding each other's eyes. I also saw the struggle in Richard's expression, caught between anger and the fear of losing everything. Sarah remained silent, leaving the decision to me. The lawyer waited, his hand resting on the documents. Finally, Richard sat down. He did not say another word, but I knew he understood. Not because he agreed with me, but because he realized he had no other choice. I instructed the lawyer to revise the clause according to what I had just outlined. Mark Reynolds worked quickly, asking no further questions. When the amended document was placed in front of everyone, I said they had complete freedom to decide. No one was being forced. But if they refused, the transaction would not proceed. I finished speaking and fell silent. This time, the silence no longer belonged to me. It belonged to them. The silence lasted longer than I expected. No one in the room rushed to make a decision. They looked at the amended contract, then at one another, as if searching for a way out without having to face me directly. I stood still, neither pressing nor offering further explanation. I had already said everything that needed to be said. Richard was the one who broke the stalemate. He picked up the documents and slowly flipped through the pages, though I knew he was not truly reading them. He was merely buying time, hoping that the condition would disappear if no one mentioned it again. But it did not disappear. It sat there, clear and solid, like a boundary that could not be crossed. Linda began to speak, her voice softer than usual. She mentioned family, the years they had spent together, and how money should not be allowed to destroy relationships. I listened without interrupting. When she stopped, I said only that it was their previous words and actions that had shaped this outcome, not me. A few relatives turned toward Richard, waiting for him to decide on everyone's behalf. I realized they were still accustomed to relying on one person to take responsibility for all of them. But this time, Richard no longer had the confidence to guarantee anything. He knew that any resistance now would mean losing the entire deal. Lawyer Mark Reynolds neutrally reminded everyone that without signatures, the contract would be invalid. The statement carried no emotion, but its impact was unmistakable. There were no more moral arguments, no more room for delay. Only a choice remained. Richard let out a very quiet sigh. He sat down and picked up the pen. I saw his hand tremble slightly as he placed the pen on the paper. That was the moment I knew everything was over. Not in the way he wanted, but in a way that could not be avoided. He signed his name, each stroke heavy, as if every letter were a concession. The others signed after him. No one spoke. No one looked at me. They signed like people who had accepted defeat, with no need for further explanation. When the final signature was placed, the room seemed lighter, not with relief, but because there was nothing left to hold on to. The lawyer collected the documents and confirmed that the contract was now in effect. Sarah stood up and shook hands with each person professionally. When it was my turn, she simply nodded, no words required. Everything was already clear. I stood up last. I did not look back at the table, nor did I seek anyone's eyes. I knew that in this moment there was nothing left to prove. The collapse had taken place in silence, and it was entirely legal. As I walked out of the room, I heard the faint sound of a chair shifting behind me. But I did not turn around. I did not need to know how they were looking at me. The only thing that mattered was that from this moment on, control no longer rested in the hands of those who once believed they stood above me. I stepped out of the law office building and paused for a moment on the steps. The afternoon air in Austin was hot and dry, sunlight reflecting off the glass behind me. Inside that building, everything was over. There were no more arguments, no more choices. Only signatures remained, and a reality the Coleman family would have to accept, whether they were ready for it or not. I did not hurry away. I stood there, watching people pass by, cars lining up along the busy street. The city had changed a great deal since the day I left, and so had I. I realized that throughout everything that had just happened, I did not feel victory in the way many people imagine it. There was no gloating, no sense of revenge, only a cold sense of relief, as if an old chapter had finally been closed. I heard the door open behind me. A few members of the family stepped out, slowly, like people emerging from a long exhaustion. No one called my name. No one came closer. The distance between us was no longer a few meters on the sidewalk, but a clearly established boundary. I did not turn back to look at them. I did not need any further confirmation. As I walked toward my car, my phone vibrated lightly in my pocket. It was a brief message confirming that the transaction had been activated according to the final terms. I read it and put the phone away. To me, it was simply the next step in business, nothing more. The hardest part had not been the numbers or the paperwork, but waiting for the right moment to step into my position. Before opening the car door, I paused and looked toward the road leading out of the city center. I thought about the years that had passed, the moments of being underestimated, the judging looks I had once tried to forget. I realized they no longer carried the weight they once did. They had fulfilled their role, pushing me farther, forcing me to define my own value without needing anyone's approval. I did not carry bitterness with me, nor did I carry any false forgiveness. I carried only clarity. The Coleman family had made their choices, just as I had made mine long ago. Our paths had diverged, not out of hatred, but because we no longer stood on the same set of values. As the car pulled away, I glanced at the rearview mirror one last time. The law office building gradually disappeared behind the turns. I knew that from this moment on, I would no longer appear in family meetings as a marginal name. If I ever appeared again, it would only be as the one controlling the game, without needing to explain. This story did not end with a declaration or a dramatic gesture. It ended with the silence I had learned to value. I was once considered the poorest one in that family. But the truth was, the only thing I had ever lacked was a place to stand. And when I stepped into the right position, everything else arranged itself automatically.